dusty photograph. A quiet farm in 1885. But look closely, and you'll see. The Scarecrow is holding something. The image is old, worn at the edges, its surface scratched by more than a century of handling. At first, it seems like an ordinary glimpse into the past. Acres of wheat frozen midsway, a weathered barn leaning against the horizon, the wide emptiness of the Midwestern plains stretching into forever. But there, in the background, something stands out. A crooked figure, its hat pulled low, its arms stretched wide as though caught mid-embrace. A scarecrow. At least that's what it should be. But the longer you look, the stranger it becomes. The sleeves don't hang limp. The arms don't stick out stiff like the dead limbs of a tree. They bend almost naturally, almost human-like. And in those bent arms is a shape, long and dark, gripped tightly as if whatever it is does not want to be let go. You lean in closer, eyes scanning the grain of the photograph. The shadows where the hands meet the object are thick, clinging, unnaturally dense for a bright summer's day. It's too solid to be wheat, too heavy to be fabric. The camera caught something there, something with weight, something that the Scarecrow cradles rather than simply displays. You tell yourself it must be a trick of the light, some flaw in the old emulsion, but deep down there's a pull, a quiet insistence that what you're seeing is real. And then your gaze drifts to the ground beneath it. Not a neat mound of straw as you might expect, but a shadow stretched strangely, distorted, as though the Scarecrow is leaning forward toward the camera, toward you. Back in 1885, the Pharaoh's farm sat alone among rolling plains, far from the nearest neighbor, farther still from any town worth naming. Golden wheat grew tall here, hissing gently under the wind. The air smelled of earth, sun, and the faint tang of cut grass. A weather-beaten windmill groaned slowly, pumping water from deep underground. Hand-built fences lined the edges of the property, patched in places with mismatched boards where storms had torn them apart. Life here was hard but steady. Days began before dawn with the first crow of the rooster and stretched into the long shadows of dusk. Every day was labor, no room for laziness, no escape from the cycle of work the land demanded. The Pharaoh family kept to themselves. Jacob, the father, was a quiet man whose back had bent slightly over the years from tilling soil and lifting more than his share of heavy loads. Martha, his wife, kept the home warm and clean, a small fortress against the loneliness that came with living so far from others. Their son, Samuel, 14 and restless, helped his father when called but often dreamed of the world beyond the wheat. In the center of their largest field stood the Scarecrow, Jacob's creation, built from spare wood, stuffed with straw, and dressed in Samuel's old coat and boots. A wide-brimmed hat hid most of its face, such as it was. At a glance, it seemed ordinary. Yet the neighbors, the few who ever passed this way, said it hadn't always stood where it did now. It had been moved, dragged from the far end of the property to its present spot a few weeks before that strange photograph was taken. No one knew who had moved it. No one admitted to touching it at all. One late summer afternoon, a traveling photographer named Henry Dalton arrived in the area. His wagon carried a heavy wooden camera, glass plates, and bottles of chemicals that smelled sharp and sour. He made his living offering portraits to families in far-off farms, a rare and treasured thing for those who might never again have their likeness captured. Henry found the Pharaoh farm by following the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood. Jacob was repairing a fence post when the stranger appeared. The deal was simple. Henry could stay the night in the barn in exchange for taking the family's photograph. Jacob agreed, and soon Henry was unpacking his tripod and adjusting the camera's polished brass fittings. As Henry scouted for the perfect composition, his gaze drifted to the Scarecrow standing among the wheat. Something about its posture caught him, the slight tilt of its head, the way its coat hung heavily on its frame. Why not include it in the shot? Henry asked, half joking. A little rustic charm never hurts. Martha, who had been standing near the barn door, stiffened at once. No, she said quickly, her voice flat. It's just for the crows, and nothing more. She didn't take her eyes off the field as she spoke, as though even looking away might be a mistake. Henry chuckled lightly, thinking it was nothing more than an odd quirk, but he made a mental note of her unease. As the sun began to sink, Henry positioned Jacob, Martha, and Samuel in front of the barn. The light was golden and long, the kind photographers dream of. He adjusted the focus, moving the lens slightly, and there it was again, the Scarecrow just over Jacob's shoulder in the far distance. He hesitated, his eye still pressed to the ground glass. The object in the Scarecrow's hands was more distinct now, dark against the lighter stalks of wheat. It wasn't a bundle of straw or a tangle of weeds. It had shape, substance, and the way the Scarecrow seemed to lean into it, almost protectively, made Henry's skin prickle. No one else in the family was looking toward it. No one else seemed to notice at all. He held his breath as he counted the exposure in his head, the seconds ticking silently in the fading light. When he finally capped the lens and stepped back, he shook off the odd feeling that had settled over him. Perhaps it was just his imagination, stirred by the strange isolation of this place. But later, in the dim interior of the barn, when the image began to form on the wet glass plate, his curiosity sharpened into unease. The Scarecrow was there, just as before, crooked, silent, still. But now, in the photograph's frozen clarity, the object in its hands seemed more than a shadow. It seemed deliberate, held, clutched, and it was something that, as far as Henry knew, no one had ever placed there. In the dim interior of the barn, the air hung heavy with the sharp tang of photographic chemicals. Henry stood hunched over the developing tray, the glass plate negative slowly revealing the frozen scene from earlier that day. The family stood crisp and clear in the foreground, their expressions locked in that timeless stillness old portraits always carried. But his eyes didn't stay on them. They drifted to the far background, where the wheat parted around the Scarecrow's crooked shape. The posture was wrong, bent slightly forward, as though the weight in its arms pulled it down. In its hands, that same dark shape had emerged from shadow, soft-edged yet solid, like a bundle wrapped in cloth. He frowned, leaning closer until his breath fogged the plate. It had to be a trick of the light, maybe the blurred movement of wheat caught in the breeze at the exact moment the shutter snapped. But the shape was too defined for that, too still in the chaos of swaying stalks. Henry hung the plate carefully to dry, but his curiosity wouldn't let go. He pulled out the other exposures from the day, each taken at slightly different angles as he adjusted the family's position. He expected the bundle to shift or vanish in one of them, proof that it was just some fleeting accident of the light. But no, in every image the dark shape was there. Same position, same tilt, same unyielding presence. It was as though the Scarecrow had not only been still but intentional, a deliberate participant in the photograph, clinging to whatever it held like it mattered more than the purpose it had been built for. Henry set the plates aside and told himself not to dwell on it. But he noticed something else before turning away. The Scarecrow's head, in each shot, was angled ever so slightly toward the camera, as though aware of being watched. That night, the farmhouse glowed warm against the darkness outside, the light from the oil lamps spilling across the wooden table where Henry sat with Jacob. A half-empty pot of coffee steamed between them, its bitter scent masking the faint smell of kerosene from the lantern nearby. Henry asked casually about the Scarecrow, careful not to let too much of his fascination show. Jacob took a slow sip before answering, his eyes fixed on the flame. "It's there to keep more than crows away," he said quietly, almost to himself. The words were deliberate, as if each one was chosen with care. Before Henry could press for more, Martha's voice cut in from the stove. "It's just stuffed with straw," she said sharply, turning to face them. "Nothing more. Leave it be." She held his gaze a moment too long, and Henry could see there was something in her expression. Not anger exactly, but the brittle edge of someone guarding a truth they didn't want spoken aloud. Later, after the dishes were done and the family began settling for the night, Samuel found Henry alone in the hall. The boy's voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, it moves," he said, glancing toward the window that looked out on the fields. Henry frowned, thinking Samuel was teasing him, but the boy's face was pale and serious. "At night, I've heard it. The wheat's still, but it rustles, like it's walking. He paused, as though deciding whether to say more, then added, Pa says it's just the wind, but Ma doesn't go near it anymore. Not since last summer. Before Henry could ask what happened last summer, Samuel had already retreated up the stairs, leaving that unfinished sentence hanging in the dim hallway like a shadow no lantern could chase away. The next morning, Henry sat at the kitchen table with the plates spread before him, studying them in the light. The back door creaked open and a tall man stepped inside, carrying a basket of fresh eggs. His clothes were worn but neat, his face tanned and lined from years of working outdoors. Martha greeted him by name, Elias Carter, and they exchanged polite words before his gaze drifted to Henry's work on the table. He stepped closer, peering at the glass plates with an expression that slowly hardened. "You took this yesterday?" he asked. Henry nodded, uncertain where the question was leading. Elias's eyes fixed on the small, far-off figure in the photograph. "Shouldn't keep that thing in your pictures," he muttered. When Henry asked why, Elias leaned on the back of a chair, his voice low enough that Martha, busy at the stove, couldn't hear. "Don't stay near it after dark," he said. "Last family that lived on this land. Their little girl went missing. Never found her." His eyes flicked toward the window, toward the golden sea of wheat beyond. "Some folks said they saw the Scarecrow in the barn after. Said it was holding something." Henry felt a cold stir in his chest. "Holding what?" he asked. Elias's jaw tightened. "A toy. Little wooden horse that belonged to the girl. Looked like it was cradling it, like it didn't want to let go." Henry tried to mask his unease, but the story settled into him like a splinter beneath the skin. Elias straightened, shifting the basket of eggs in his hands. "If you've got any sense," he said finally, "you'll burn it before the next new moon." He didn't wait for Henry's reply, just nodded once to Martha, stepped out into the sunlight, and walked back down the dirt road until he was swallowed by the distance. The door closed behind him, leaving Henry alone with the plates, the Scarecrow's shadowy bundle staring back at him from the frozen grain. Henry didn't speak of Elias's warning right away, but the words followed him for the rest of the day, trailing behind every chore and conversation like an unwelcome shadow. Even when he wasn't looking at the photographs, he could still picture them in his mind. The rigid frame of the Scarecrow, the unnatural bend of its elbows, the way the bundle seemed pressed against its chest as though it were shielding something precious. When he stepped outside, the figure was still there in the field, a smudge of darkness against the gold of the wheat, and though it hadn't moved an inch, he felt the same subtle pressure of being watched. The breeze tugged lazily at his shirt, but out in the wheat, the Scarecrow's coat barely stirred. It was as though the wind chose not to touch it. That night, as the farmhouse settled into sleep, Henry found himself restless. The boards creaked under his steps as he crossed to the window and pushed aside the thin curtain. Moonlight washed over the field in silver, and there, far out where the wheat shimmered, stood the Scarecrow, its shape sharp and defined against the pale glow. For a moment, Henry thought he saw its head tilt slightly, almost acknowledging him. His pulse quickened, and he blinked hard, telling himself it was just his eyes playing tricks in the dim light. But then, faintly, he saw the wheat move at its feet, not swaying like the rest of the field, but parting, as though something stepped slowly through it. And all the while, the Scarecrow's arms remained locked around whatever it carried. The sound pulled Henry from sleep, a deep, steady rush that he thought at first was wind. But as his senses sharpened, he realized the air was still. The wheat outside his window stood frozen in place, each stalk motionless in the silver wash of the moon. Frowning, he stepped closer to the glass. That's when he saw it, the Scarecrow's head, moving with a slow, deliberate turn, until its blank face was aimed directly at the house. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then Henry's stomach dropped. The Scarecrow's arms weren't empty. In its stiff embrace, framed in the pale light, was something round and swaddled, roughly the size of a human head. He blinked hard, but the shape remained, and the stillness of the night felt heavier than air should allow. The morning brought no comfort. Determined to prove to himself it was nothing, Henry grabbed his camera and walked the narrow dirt path into the wheat. Each step muffled in the stalks, the Scarecrow rose before him, its shadow stretching unnaturally long in the low sun. He stopped short, the dark coat hung heavy, its sleeves glistening faintly as though damp. Yet the soil beneath was dry, the sky cloudless. His gaze dropped to its hands. The bundle was real, burlap wrapped tight with twine, its shape disturbingly familiar. Henry reached out, fingers brushing the rough fabric, when Jacob's voice cracked across the field. "Leave it alone." The urgency in the old man's tone froze Henry where he stood. Jacob didn't speak again, only stood at the porch, face pale, until Henry stepped back. Later that day, Samuel found him in the barn loft, clutching something against his chest. Without a word, he held it out. A weathered leather journal, its pages browned and curling at the edges. Henry flipped through brittle entries scrawled in a nervous hand. The thing in the wheat, the watcher in the field, payment in kind. As the words blurred together, the meaning clawed its way into Henry's mind. A final entry, nearly illegible, read, "It demanded a gift. I gave it one. Now it sleeps." His pulse spiked as he turned the page and froze. There, sketched in uneven lines, was the exact image from his photograph. The same bent posture, the same bundle in its arms. The Scarecrow's pose had not changed in decades. That night, Henry couldn't bring himself to sleep. The journal lay open on the table beside him, its brittle pages whispering each time the house shifted. Every so often, he would glance toward the window, half expecting to see the Scarecrow silhouetted against the moon again. The bundle in its arms gnawed at his thoughts. Too small for a body, too large for a simple offering. Around midnight, the sound returned. Not wind, but something moving. A dry rustle, steady and purposeful. Henry forced himself to the window. The Scarecrow hadn't moved, but the wheat around it rippled in a perfect circle, as though something unseen was pacing just beyond its reach. The following morning, the air felt heavy, thick with a heat that didn't belong to early autumn. Henry tried to busy himself with chores, but the Scarecrow was always in the corner of his vision, its burlap-covered head tilted just enough to suggest awareness. Twice, he caught Samuel staring at it from the barn, lips moving silently as if reciting something. When Henry asked what he was saying, Samuel only shook his head and walked away. But as the boy passed, Henry caught a few words under his breath. Words that didn't sound like English at all. Henry waited until the sun dipped low, the wheat turning to shadow under the copper light of evening. He moved quietly through the house, his camera clutched tight, careful not to draw Samuel's or Jacob's attention. From the upstairs window, he framed the Scarecrow in his lens. The thing stood rigid, bundle cradled in its stitched arms, its burlap head tilted slightly down as though it was looking at what it carried. The shutter clicked, and the sound felt too loud, like it might be heard in the empty field. When Henry developed the image in his small darkroom, the photograph revealed more than his eyes had seen. The bundle was not just cloth and twine, it was a doll. Its fabric face was mottled and sagging, button eyes clouded with age. Its stitched mouth seemed cruelly pulled into silence. Worse, the edges of the doll's face glistened, as if damp, though no rain had fallen in days. The sight made Henry's stomach tighten. This was no simple farm decoration. That night, the air shifted. The warmth of the day gave way to a pressing chill, carried on a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. Clouds gathered fast, smothering the moon, and the first growl of thunder rolled across the fields. Henry lay in bed, restless, the journal's final words echoing in his head. "I gave it one. Now it sleeps." A sudden, deep brushing sound scraped along the side of the house, too heavy for branches, too deliberate for the wind. He froze, holding his breath. Another sound followed, closer this time, something dragging against the porch boards. Lightning flared outside, filling the room with stark, white light for a fraction of a second. In that blink, Henry saw it. The Scarecrow was gone from the field. It now stood at the porch's edge, bundle still in its arms, its shadow spilling unnaturally long across the yard. Henry's shout brought Jacob stumbling from his room, lantern in hand. Without speaking, they both pushed into the storm, rain beginning to spit in cold, uneven drops. The porch boards groaned under their weight as they stepped forward. The field beyond was empty, save for the restless sway of wheat. Then lightning ripped across the sky, and for a brief, blinding instant, the Scarecrow was there again. Back in its place, rigid arms folded around nothing. At their feet, half soaked in the rain, lay the bundle. Jacob knelt and untied the coarse twine with trembling hands. The burlap sagged open, revealing not straw or cloth scraps, but tiny bones, no bigger than a child's hand. They were wrapped in a strip of faded, weather-worn fabric. The cloth was stained, fraying at the edges, but the embroidered letters remained clear. The initials of the child who had gone missing years ago, the one the townsfolk had quietly stopped speaking of. Henry's breath came fast, his heart pounding against his ribs, but before either man could speak, the storm answered for them. Another flash of lightning split the darkness, this one hanging for a moment longer than seemed natural. In that prolonged, unnatural glare, they both saw it. The Scarecrow's head, once bowed toward the bundle, was now turned fully toward the house. Its button eyes gleamed wetly in the rain, its stitched mouth curving, almost imperceptibly, upward. The wind howled through the wheat, but in the spaces between the gusts, Henry thought he heard something else. A low, rattling whisper, carried from the field, saying words in the same strange tongue Samuel had spoken under his breath. The Scarecrow stood still, yet it felt closer somehow, as if the distance between the porch and the field had grown thinner, the space between them shrinking with each blink. Henry gripped the lantern tighter, but deep down, he knew no light could keep it away forever. The morning came gray and cold, the mist hanging low over the wheat fields. Jacob and Elias moved without speaking, their boots crunching over the frost-hardened soil. Henry watched from the porch as they dragged the Scarecrow from its post, its limp frame swaying as if reluctant to leave the field. They hauled it toward a shallow pit dug the night before, the wind carrying the faint rustle of its straw-stuffed limbs. When Elias struck the match, the flare of flame seemed too bright for the hour. The fire caught quickly, licking up the old coat and stuffing, but the smell that rose was not the dry, papery scent of burning straw. It was thick, greasy, and foul, a stench that clung to the throat and made the eyes sting. Jacob turned his face away, muttering something Henry couldn't hear. The bundle, once clutched so tightly in the Scarecrow's grip, had been wrapped again and carried to the far end of the property, to the old family plot where weathered stones leaned like tired sentinels. There, it was placed in the ground and covered with soil, as though putting it to rest. The flames in the pit spat and hissed, and for a moment, Henry thought he saw a dark shape twist in the smoke before it was gone. By the time Henry left the farm, the pit was cold ash and the Scarecrow was nothing but a memory scorched into the earth. Yet his mind was far from free. He carried with him the glass plate negatives, 3 exposures taken on different days. Under the dim glow of his lamp weeks later, he examined them again, each more unsettling than the last. In the first, the Scarecrow faced the road, the bundle held low. In the second, its head was turned toward the farmhouse, the bundle drawn close. And in the third, the bundle was open. Inside, faint but clear against the silvered plate, was the suggestion of a pale, skeletal hand curled in stillness. No wind could have done that. No trick of light could make bones where there were none. He set the plates down, his hands trembling, knowing he would never return to that place. Some stories, he thought, are better left untold, some photographs better left undeveloped. Yet the image of that twisted figure in the wheat lingered in his mind. Not just the way it looked, but the way it seemed to wait. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the dark ceiling, the final thought came unbidden. Maybe it was just straw. Maybe it was something older. But in 1885, on a lonely farm, the Scarecrow was holding something, and it wasn't letting go.